Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us again. Dr. Virginia Summy here. And today we are joined by Dr. Adrienne Petty, who is an associate professor of history at William and Mary. And her book, Standing Their Ground, Small Farmers in North Carolina Since the Civil War, came out in 2013 by Oxford University Press. And as most of you know, who's been following the Civil War doc and our happy hours and the interviews that we do, know that I am a native North Carolinian, although not from the southeastern part of the state that Dr. Petty covers. And so in her book, she talks about small farmers in the post-Civil War era. And so I would like to, we'll have a conversation here with Dr. Petty. And I'm going to start with basically why the focus on these small or on these, 7 counties in southeastern North Carolina. What makes them particularly distinct. As I said, for a Western North Carolinian like me, we drive through them on the way to the beach, but don't often stop and think about, what makes these counties in North Carolina historically significant and special.
Oh, thanks for that question. I can, this book had its start as my doctoral dissertation. And the dissertation, well, first of all, before I start all this, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about this book. And so as I was saying, this book started as a doctoral dissertation, and by the same name, I called that one Standing Their Ground too. And that dissertation focused on a number of North Carolina counties: Wilson, Granville, Bladen, Duplin, and I think that's it. So initially, the dissertation started much later, started in 1920, and focused on a number of North Carolina tobacco producing counties. And the way that I chose the 2 southeastern counties, Duplin and Bladen, was that I looked at one of these USDA reports about Black farmers, and Duplin and Bladen were 2 of the counties that, as late as I think it was 2007, still had significant numbers of Black farmers. And so my question about Black farmers and small farmers in general has always been not so much why did their numbers decline, because some of those forces are we know some of why that happened. But my question has always been, why were they able to persist as long as they did? That's the question that I started both my dissertation and this book with. And so after finishing the dissertation, I found that the story in southeastern North Carolina, in those 2 counties, and then the more expanded group that I cover in the book, really had a very interesting story when you took it back to the post-Civil War period, because you have this transition from the naval stores industry and farmers who had been engaged in that migrating further and further south to, that opened up opportunities for both white, Black, and then, in parts of southeastern North Carolina, Lumbees as well, to gain hold of pretty small acreage, but also to get involved in tobacco production. So I guess that's why I ultimately settled on that area, because it was such an interesting area for this proliferation of small farms at a time where you don't really think of farm ownership growing. Mm-hmm. And, I was interested in why that happened in that area. Managed to persist as long as they did throughout the 20th century.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit, because you do talk a little bit about the antebellum era in that. So what, just real briefly before we go into the thick of things, what was the antebellum era, the what was slavery like in that area? What was the antebellum area like? We know it was like naval stores and tobacco, and
A
but
little bit of tobacco, but not the variety that came to be most prevalent.
not the bright leaf.
Not the bright leaf, but and cotton too.
Mhm.
And the book, the historian that I relied on most for my knowledge of, not my knowledge or his knowledge, is William McKee Evans, who is from southeastern North Carolina, who I had the opportunity to meet. And I don't know where he is now, but he was so wonderful to me. I think I met him at a Southern, and he just sat with me and we talked about, he pointed me in all the directions, like where to learn more about that region. And his book, Ballot Boxes, why can't I remember the exact title, but it's a classic
Yeah.
book on Reconstruction in North Carolina, and that book was invaluable. But anyway, cotton, limited tobacco production, self-sufficient farms, very much like the region that you're from, that were people during that period, the smaller farmers, not the slave owners, but the smaller farmers were mostly kind of safety first farmers.
Okay.
But it was a region of slave ownership as well. And those slave owners enslaved people to the task of, naval stores, like tapping pine trees for turpentine and tar and pitch, and tobacco, cotton production mostly.
Yeah.
That transition to bright tobacco came about, during Reconstruction mostly.
Right. With like the Dukes and the Reynolds. Like I said, I'm in Winston-Salem, so I can see the Reynolds building right now.
My goodness.
I joked that my city gave us, like we're a cancer and heart disease dream team city because we have tobacco and Krispy Kreme. So,
Right.
all the fun stuff what we have here in Winston-Salem. But yeah, so going back to southeastern North Carolina, particularly, after the end of the Civil War, and we have these small farmers who are who were surviving. We would say surviving, maybe not thriving, but surviving. How does the populist movement that emerges in South or in North Carolina affect this area of the state?
Well, so the populist movement, before that, the farmers' alliances were active in that part of the state, and farmers were coming together. The Farmers Alliance and the Colored Farmers Alliances were forming, and just trying to bring about better conditions for farmers who were in both land owning and landless farmers, because they were just being buffeted, decimated by this series of panics that happened during the late 19th century, and also just the expansion of capitalism into the realm of agriculture, both in terms of railroad and freight rates, and falling prices for farm commodities because of competition and because of depressed conditions. And so these farmers' alliances were really trying to advocate for themselves to have, fairer conditions.
Right.
And of course, part of what happened is that by, Black and white, and I'm not as sure, I would love to do more research on the extent to which indigenous farmers were engaged in this too in North Carolina. I don't know. I didn't find as much evidence of that, but I didn't, I don't think I've exhausted that question. So I'd like to one day, in all my free time, go back and figure out that story. But anyway, the coming together, to the extent that Black and white farmers, smaller farmers, saw their interests intersecting and built coalitions together, kind of contributed to the coming of Jim Crow, because, you know, that's when the kind of white supremacy campaigns of trying to appeal to white voters and their interest as, you know, being allied with the white elites of the state, really undermined these efforts of, you know, farmers trying to find common cause to deal with their common issues. So I see the populist movement as an example of a period when there was a possibility for solidarity among these smaller farmers, but that was quickly, you know, extinguished, put out, you know, during the late 19th century. And I mean, this area that I focus on is basically the hinterland of Wilmington, North Carolina.
I was about to go to Wilmington, yeah.
Yeah, so, you know, what happened in Wilmington, we always understand as very much focused on that urban area, you know, with the Alex Manley and all of the controversy that happened within Wilmington. But I think if we, you know, branch out and see what was going on in the countryside, also contributed to that. Wilmington also contributed to what happened in Wilmington. And
yeah, okay. So you're basically saying, you know, that the white supremacist movement kind of filtered in through the countryside into Wilmington, and then it's,
yeah, I don't know if it filtered in or if this was just like a parallel thing. I'm not sure. I don't characterize it in the book, and I'm still not clear how I would explain.
yeah.
I would at the very least see them as parallel and somewhat overlapping developments that are contributing to this, because I mean, and at the very least, the connections between the growing kind of elite in Wilmington and those in the countryside, like they definitely have shared interests.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think.
Yeah. So I mean, we know that I'm trying to think, I can't think which county off the top of my head, but, you know, Aycock, who was one of the leaders of this movement, was from a small farm in Eastern North Carolina. Yeah. So
I can't remember the county, but I can't remember either.
But yeah, but he was from, you know, he was part of this, you know, part of these small farm, you know, groups of small farmers. That's really, really interesting. So you say in your introduction that, you know, the emergence of capitalist social relations, you know, constrained the prospects of smallholders, and it was even more challenging to realize the ideal to which they aspired. Can you could you talk about that, you know, about this, you know, and kind of how the and this, you know, piggybacks off of the talking about populist movement, but how the independent way of farming, family, local self-determination became more difficult as, you know, through the rise of capitalism, particularly, you know, I guess in the early 20th century.
Oh yes. Well, part of what I'm referring to is even as early as the late 19th century, as you know, farmers who had formerly, and mostly I'm talking about from the antebellum perspective, mostly I'm talking about small white farm owners who, or the yeoman farmers, who had been accustomed to, you know, being pretty self-sufficient and only engaged in cash crop production to the extent that it helped them pay their taxes, or it helped them, you know, just have some cash on hand. But their primary focus was to, you know, as you mentioned earlier, feed their families and just maintain a minimum level of kind of self-sufficiency and independence. Well, the transition that occurred during and after the Civil War contributed to, you know, the kind of the financial system changed because of the end of slavery. So emancipation in the countryside, and made it so that, you know, smaller farmers now had to, I mean, were kind of compelled to become more engaged in cash crop production, whether they wanted to or not. In order to secure any type of credit, they had to grow a minimum amount of cotton, or increasingly bright tobacco. And that really put pressure. Oh, the need for tax revenue contributed to this as well. So whether the point I tried to make in that book is that whether they wanted to or not, they were drawn more and more into the capitalist system. And that goes not only for the white yeoman farmers, but also for this emerging group of Black farmers and the Lumbee farmers who are active in farming or becoming active in farming during the late 19th century. And so what I do throughout the book is talk about these kind of successive and overlapping developments, starting in the late 19th, early 20th century, and extending into the 20th century, that really put pressure on these small farmers. And I attempt to focus on the ways that they resist those pressures. But so let me mention a few of the other things that kind of are examples of capitalist incursion into farming and the pressure that they put on people. So one is just the, fence laws.
I was going to ask about fence laws.
Yeah, so just making it so that people had to fence in their animals rather than allowing for open range, which enabled a lot of small farmers to keep. And I, you know, obviously the focus of my book is on people who own their own farms, or at least own part of their own farms. But this held for tenant farmers and sharecroppers too. So the ability to have pigs or cattle and have them roam, you know, on common land ground really enabled people to make a living. And so once those laws kind of required that people start to fence in their animals, and they were limited to their own acreage for having those animals graze, that had devastating impacts on all classes of farmers, I would say. Because even one of the examples I give in the book is of Duplin County, where even large landowners balked against this. Even people were, you know, considered to have a significant amount of acres. They threatened to fence in the whole county rather than go along with this. But eventually, you know, now I'm not going to remember, but there was a year when eventually every North Carolina county had fallen under this system of not allowing open grazing of animals. And then you know, same with hunting and fishing laws, you know, making it so that it was criminalizing hunting on other people's land, that in a way that used to be understood as you know, commonly held land. Fishing, all of these were laws that had their start in Reconstruction and had to do with that efforts to compel the freed people to continue in these, unequal and exploitative relationships like sharecropping or trying to approximate slavery as closely as possible.
Right.
But they had an impact beyond the freed people. They did undermine the ability of the yeoman farmers, and who I call small farmers, to make a living.
Yeah. When I teach Greensboro history, I teach at UNCG, so I teach Greensboro history, or the history of the Triad. We talk a lot about, the fence laws, particularly as it pertains to, Western North Carolinians. A lot of these small farmers in Western North Carolina came down into, like, for instance, Greensboro to work in textile mills. And so do you see, where did some of these small farmers who, were put under by these fence laws and put under by these new restrictions, did they stay in the area? Did they leave?
There was, so because I was so focused on people who stayed, I know somewhat about that, but I didn't do as much research on that. But yes, some of them ended up going to places like the region where I am, the Tidewater of Virginia, or, working in shipbuilding, or working in stevedores and things like that. So some of them ended up in kind of coastal North Carolina, and in those coastal North Carolina and coastal Virginia, in that region. And there's also, later on, there's the expansion of the just still forestry stuff, like paper mills and that kind of. You have opportunities for employment. And there's a chapter I have that focuses on the post-World War II period, nice work if you can get it. And the whole point of that chapter is to focus on the kind of the impact that discriminatory hiring practices in industry had on Black farmers in particular, because white farmers were able to avail themselves more readily of employment, like part-time employment, or having one member of the family get a full-time job in public work, and another member, usually the wife, stay home and run the farm. Those kinds of arrangements weren't as available to Black farmers. Somewhat available to Lumbee farmers, but even they did not have the same degree of access to these kinds of non-farm jobs as the white farmers did. So I single that out as one of the factors that allowed white farmers to survive more readily than the non-white farmers.
Right. So the last, or two more questions. So you also say that, people were trying to break into farm owning for the first time, even though the number of overall farms was declining. Does that just go back to that, obviously, this is not, even though you didn't go into small farming to, as a huge money maker, did it just go back to that idea, that kind of idealistic idea of, self-sufficiency, self-determination? Was it because of the availability of land? How why do people keep going to this?
I think it is because of I think it changes a little bit, because you mentioned, the white farmers during the early part of the century who were able to transition to tobacco. Well, you didn't talk about tobacco, but some of them, and so even some of the Black farmers also, I didn't mention that, but cigarette manufacturing related businesses like tobacco stemmeries or cigarette manufacturing plants and all of that. So But those jobs were, there was a pecking order in terms of who got which jobs. And I think that, part of what accounts for the persistence of people's aspiration to own farmland is simply it's not only just that old notion of independence and self-sufficiency in a very agricultural, in a context where the majority of people were engaged in agricultural production, but it also is as more and more people are leaving agricultural production, either because of the Great Migration or because of opportunities in Southern, among the growing, industrializing South, they are also in search of independence from wage work at that point. Right. So wage work had gained such a hold, even in the South, which has been persistently rural, as you know, or was persistently rural at the time. Even then, people, had a taste of that kind of thing and didn't like it. I mean, some people, or they were fine with continuing wage work, but they still wanted to, either because of family tradition or because of, the very real way that having even a limited garden was subsidized, kind of help subsidize people's livelihood. It still held a lot of appeal for people. Yeah. And then, the North Carolina governors, in that same Nice Work If You Can Get It chapter, I discuss the Governor Luther Hodges during the 50s promoted North Carolina as a destination for Northern industry. Right. Because he said, look, we have this very, sizable small farm population. He was definitely referring to the white farm population. He said we have a sizable white farm population that is hardworking and have these farms, and that will enable them to, basically saying you can pay them cheaper wages because they've got these farms. Yes. And so the state they exploited that, but that's at the same time as the federal government is promoting get big or get out during the Eisenhower administration. Right. So it's a very, contradictory and kind of cynical view that policymakers were taking at the time, kind of exploiting people's desire to remain on farms while doing nothing to help them remain on those farms. Yes.
And so there's a video attracting businesses from the same time to Wilkesboro. And it talks about, and these people don't want to unionize. Yes. They have no interest in unionizing.
I'm glad you brought that up. And would you send me that video? Because I want to show my class that, because when I tell them these things, I don't think that the students, well, actually now things are changing. What's going on with Amazon and so forth is changing students' consciousness of unions in a big way. But before, they'd be like, well, why would they want a union? I was like, oh.
I as a born and bred Carolinian, I pretty much had to learn what unions were when I got older, because they were not something that we had in North Carolina. But yes, it was a really interesting video that talks about the white labor that doesn't want to unionize. Exactly. So I will send you that. But yeah, so we're making a Civil War documentary, and we're focusing beyond the battlefield. And so what would you like to see coming forth from a new Civil War documentary, as it particularly as it pertains to the legacy of small farms, the legacy of agriculture?
I think the main thing is to try to capture Well, I think existing, I don't even know if this is true. Let me get my thoughts together before I start talking. Well, I think in general, just capturing that experience of rural Southerners, whether they are, um, whether the white yeoman farmers or like focusing on the folks that Carrie Lee focuses on in Masterless Men, who don't really appear as much in the story. Like
Right.
we don't know as much about white people whose children were apprenticed and white people who were desperately poor. And that's part of like, in a way, I'm talking about the same group because I'm not only concerned with yeoman farmers who had had land before the Civil War, but there were quite a few white people who were gaining land for the first time after the Civil War. They were people who had not had land. They had been engaged in Eastern North Carolina, mainly Southeastern, but I think also the northern counties too. There were systems of sharecropping already in place. And during the antebellum period, and we don't think about the ways that, we don't think about this transition during emancipation, what it meant for the white farmers as well. And so what the approach I try to sustain in this book that is not always popular is to take seriously looking at freed people and the yeoman farmers who held on to their land and the white farmers who didn't have land before the Civil War, like taking them seriously as a group of people who ultimately, by virtue of gaining hold of small farms, shared these similar interests, even though politically they were discouraged from seeing themselves as allies. And I think it has a lot of lessons for our own time. So if the Civil War documentary could really, put these things in, not only capturing the racism of the system, but also capturing the class bias, that would be an amazing contribution.
Yes, no doubt. I tell my students when I teach, North Carolina, particularly from, the perspective of poor whites, that slavery was a job killer. I mean, you're just kind of shoveling your dirt from one side of the yard to the other, and but that, as Carrie Lee brings up often, that these biracial coalitions are often very intentionally broken up by the powers that be when you have so much more to fight together for. But yes, well, thank you so very much for joining us, everybody. The book, it's been around, but it's so good.
It's so old.
It's not in academic years, but yes, standing their ground, small farmers in North Carolina since the Civil War. And catch us later for more scholarly interviews over the summer. Thanks.